Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Chris Avery, and I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to the note that I believe is about to be put into the chat box. I want to let everybody know that the audio for all participants is disabled, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them into the chat. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Eliza Lustig, who is our technical support person today. Please also note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards each other per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide. I will kick off our webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before I turn it over to the agriculture chapter authors on the call today. Next slide. For those of you who are just getting to know USGCRP, the U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to, as you see on the quote here on the slide, assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 15 federal agencies to advance climate and global change science to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide. The same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment, known as the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and educators. Next slide. Excuse me. NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive, and it does not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and leaves up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process involves extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Next slide. So now let's take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview, which is followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then there are national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although response actions are discussed throughout the report. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features on compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. We also have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. So, with that introductory background, it's now my pleasure to introduce Carl Bolster, the chapter lead of the agriculture chapter, who will lead us through the remainder of the webinar today. Carl, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for that introduction to the NCA5. Good afternoon, everyone. As Chris said, my name is Carl Bolster. I am the chapter lead for the Agriculture, Food Systems, and Rural Communities chapter. Now, I've asked three of our authors, Virginia Jin, Danelle Peck, and Tracy Farragut, to give an overview of each of our key messages. But before I do that, I just want to give a brief overview to the chapter. First, at the direction of the Federal Steering Committee, an important change has been made to this chapter from previous assessments, and that is the addition of the topic of food systems. This reflects a growing awareness of the role of food systems in climate change. Indeed, food system was a major topic discussed in the COP28 conference recently held in Dubai. So one of the major challenges in writing these chapters is the strict word limit. So how do we choose our messages, our key messages, for a chapter covering such a wide range of topics? Here we go. Okay. So one of the major, so how do we choose our key messages? Well, it's an important process in the development of our chapter and included review of the pertinent literature by the author team, consideration of topics previously covered in NCA4, other relevant documents, and topics covered in other chapters of NCA5. So for instance, while water issues will always be important to agriculture, we did not focus on that in this document, in this chapter, because it was emphasized in NCA4, and it is also discussed in several of the regional chapters and the water chapter in NCA5. So we also received a lot of input from the public through workshops and calls for comments. To those out there, we do listen. The public had a significant input in the direction that this chapter took. We had input from the Federal Steering Committee that Chris referenced earlier, and review comments from an ad hoc committee of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So, okay, our three key messages. The first one, key message one, agricultural adaptation increases resilience in an evolving landscape. I've got my notes here. Something happened to my notes. Hang on. Okay, we're going to go without notes. So in this, we highlighted several important disruptions in agriculture caused by changing climate. While agriculture has always faced unpredictable weather, changing climate poses additional challenges. Adopting agroecological approaches that focus on soil health, adaptive conservation management, diversification of landscapes, and climate-smart practices that target the right amount, source placement, and timing of nitrogen fertilizers can lead to increased productivity, resilience to climate change, and reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. In key message two, climate change disrupts our food systems in uneven ways. We discuss the effect of climate change on food security, including accessibility, stability, and that this is going to impact people unevenly throughout the community in uneven ways, and it's going to be reflected on by historical inequities. And then in key message three, rural communities face unique challenges and opportunities. We describe the impacts and unique challenges and opportunities faced by rural communities to climate change. Rural communities manage much of the nation's land and natural resources, have unique knowledge of rural landscapes, and supply labor for agricultural production and other economic sectors. Budgetary and social constraints, along with increasing rate and severity of climate disasters, create disproportionate hardships in rural communities. The resiliency of rural communities to climate change is hindered when climate risks are compounded by historical environmental justice inequities. So with that, I'm going to hand off now to Virginia, who is going to talk about get into the details of our key message one.
Thank you so much, Carl. Really appreciate the introduction, and thanks everybody for coming to our webinar today. It was such a great experience working with our co-author team to come up with the chapter content. I was one of the authors working on our key message one, which really revolved around this agricultural adaptation, increasing resilience in our evolving landscapes. And so I myself am a soil scientist, and I'm here in Lincoln, Nebraska with the Agricultural Research Service. And this topic is very, very close to my own research program, and so of high interest to me as well, not just in what we're finding in that research world, but how these findings are being employed with conservation practices and agroecologically based practices, so that our rural communities and our producers and our industry can really adapt and be resilient to these climate changes. Key message one, again, is really emphasizing how climate change is impacting our agricultural landscapes, and that the use of adaptive management can be used to build resilience to those changes. When we think about our long-term climate records, those really indicate that these disruptions, they have been disruptions in the seasonality and in the amount of precipitation, in air temperatures, soil moisture, and moisture availability. And all of these components are really key to crop and animal production, as well as the many different agroecosystem services that we depend on. For example, air temperatures have been increasing steadily, and the impact of that on U.S. growing seasons has essentially been to increase the growing season length in some places by as long as 2 weeks. Those types of changes have a big impact on the way that our farming systems are run. And it also has impact on weather volatility, the onset of extreme events, and vulnerability of our crop and livestock to pests and disease. That said, we have a lot of, there's been a lot of increasing adoption of conservation management practices and agroecologically based practices that help diversify land use and farm revenue streams too. This diversification is really the key to help restoring resilience to degraded agricultural landscapes. And at the same time, this diversification can be informed by that historical conventional management, as well as indigenous knowledge and other knowledge sources. In the last 10 years alone, U.S. producers have increasingly adopted conservation practices to maintain or improve farm productivity, including enhancement of soil health and the decrease of use of fuel, such as going to no-till and using less fuel there, or the use of agrochemicals to lower greenhouse gas emissions from our farming systems. Next, please. Next slide. Thank you. So I'm not going to go through every single one of the figures that we had in our key message one. I encourage you all to please go see our chapter and to go see all the various other graphics that we had developed to talk about these different items within adapting to climate change. But I did want to touch on just a few of the key figures that we did have in our key message one. And one is this ecosystem services that are provided. So because climate change fundamentally is disrupting soil, water, and air, it does have a huge impact on various ecosystem services that are provided by our agricultural landscapes. Agricultural lands cover more than half of the US land base. I think the last number I saw was around 52%. So these disturbances that they have high potential to lead to negative feedbacks that further degrade water and air quality, crop and animal productivity, and some of the other supporting, provisioning, cultural, and regulating services that are shown in this diagram. On the other hand, there's the possibility for positive feedbacks too, where we can use these adaptive management practices that can lead to improved ecological, economic, and societal outcomes. Next slide, please. So just to give you an example of some of these adaptive and agroecologically based practices that we're talking about, the emphasis on soil health, particularly recently in the last 10, 15 years, that's getting a lot of attention. And this idea of soil health management really is recognizing that soils, and I'm not saying this because yes, I am saying this because I'm a soil scientist and I'm biased. Soils are really, they're the very foundation of our agricultural systems. And so when we're, so the implementation of conservation-based agroecological approaches that improve soil health has been increasingly recognized as being a necessity, not just a part, but a necessity to maintain farm productivity and also for achieving a healthier environment. So not only can these agroecological approaches help support the vibrancy of our rural communities, they can also act as climate smart practices that help our producers adapt to climate change related to these disruptions. And it also, our attention to soil health also contributes to the mitigation of climate change, which is increasing atmospheric greenhouse gases. By reducing those gases directly, again, by decreasing fuel use or the emission by decreasing or more efficiently using fertilizers, as well as enhancing soil carbon storage, where we're encouraging the plants themselves to pull carbon dioxide out of the air and store it in the soils. Next slide, please. I've mentioned a couple of times during this little blurb on agroecological practices. There's a lot of different definitions for agroecology. But here, let me just really emphasize that the way that we are using agroecology is really in its scientific principle. So we know that conservation practices, and increasingly they are important tools for improving agroecosystem resilience and the stability of those systems. And many of these practices really share an agroecological foundation to their application, where ecological, economic, and social dimensions are intersecting on these ag landscapes. So in Chapter 11, we're really defining agroecology broadly as the fundamental scientific concept underpinning the use of ecological principles to design and manage our agricultural systems, and to do so sustainably. The practices that fall within this framework, they can include nature-based solutions, precision technologies, and other climate smart practices that are really aimed at promoting the adaptation and mitigation of climate change in our agroecosystems. Again, while specific practices for climate adaptation and mitigation, they're not being prescribed, we see this agroecology as the broad scientific framework that allows for practitioners to make their own evidence-based management decisions that reflect their unique environmental and socioeconomic conditions. Please do go refer to our Chapter 11. There is a dedicated box that focuses on agroecological approaches to land management. Next slide, please. And we simply cannot get through key message 1 without mentioning the impact of our production systems on greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector. It's important to note that we have had vast improvements in farm efficiencies over the last 30 years or more. But we've also had an increase in populations as well during that time. And so when we look at the emission of greenhouse gases per unit food production or per capita over the last 30 years, we see this trend of decreasing over time. That's great. However, we do want to emphasize that the total emissions that are coming from the ag sector do continue to increase. And while that's been quite slow, it is still an increase over time. And it still makes targeting our agricultural practices and our ag-related greenhouse gas emissions, mitigating those emissions is still a really critical priority. And we want to do these in ways that aren't going to compromise our rural communities or our food systems. Direct reductions in greenhouse gas emissions can really be reached through more or less through less use or more efficient use of fertilizers that would decrease nitrous oxide production. There are the potential to use feed additives or more adaptive and precision grazing techniques for animal and livestock production that would reduce methane emissions. And then there's simply just the use of management practices that require less disturbance. And most of that time, that also means the use of less agrochemicals and fuels, all of which contribute to greenhouse gas emissions from the ag sector. In addition, enhancing the carbon storage in soil has also been recognized increasingly as a key strategy for carbon mitigation as a country. And so again, here our agricultural lands are really playing a key role in finding a solution to help decrease the impact of climate change. Since our time's limited here, I really would just like to briefly mention that other parts of materials that we cover in our key message 1 in chapter 11 touch on how ag systems are affected and are affected by climate change. And these other systems include perennial and agroforestry systems, livestock production systems, aquaculture, and we even touch briefly on the interest in urban and controlled environment food production, as well as plant-based and cell-cultivated meats. So in conclusion, we have an increasing set of agroecological precision tools, technological tools, and more data. Wow, we have so much more data available to us to help us make evidence-based decisions on the land that create and maintain robust and sustainable agricultural production systems. And that resiliency really is reflected by our ag landscapes, our food systems, and in our rural communities. So with that, that concludes my summarization of key message 1. Go see our chapter, and I will turn it over to our next key message 2 presenter, Danelle Peck. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Hi, everyone. I'm Danelle Peck. I'm the director of the USDA Northern Plains Climate Hub. I'm trained as an agricultural economist, and I'm lucky to be here today to talk about the food systems key message. So key message 2 begins by exploring how climate change is affecting food systems and food security in the US. And these are 2 terms that I'm going to use quite a bit, and I'll define them for you in the next slide. So key message 2 discusses how climate change is already impacting agricultural productivity and ensured crop losses, and how it is projected to impact some food prices in the future. The chapter then goes on to discuss how these effects, again, they're felt unevenly across society. Price impacts, for example, especially affect low-wealth households, women, children, and the aging. And earlier in the chapter, you'll see a photo depicting the worsening heat stress among farm workers. The number of unsafe working days for farm workers and others who work outdoors is projected to double by mid-century. Another example of uneven impacts are disruptions to hunting, fishing, and foraging. For example, in Alaska, thinning sea ice is making travel to traditional hunting and fishing grounds more dangerous and more time-consuming for Indigenous peoples. Key message 2 contains lots of stories of challenges, but also hopeful examples that help put a human face on some of the figures that I'm going to share with you today. So as Virginia said, I really do hope that you'll go and dig into our chapter more deeply. Next slide, please. So as Carl mentioned earlier, the 5th National Climate Assessment is the first to include the term food systems in the chapter title. So what is a food system? This diagram is meant to help us understand what a food system is. It's a really complex network that encompasses all of the inputs, outputs, people, relationships that are involved in producing our food, foraging, harvesting, transporting, processing, retailing, marketing, consumption, and then onward to food loss and waste. That's how we're thinking about our food system. Now, there can be lots of different types of food systems, such as local-based food systems or trade-based systems, or often combinations of these things. And each food system has its own unique impacts on the climate, on the ecosystems, and on socioeconomic outcomes. Likewise, climate change affects these different food systems in unique ways. So the complex interactions between each of the systems that you see here in this figure end up influencing our food security. And as Carl mentioned earlier, what we mean by that is food availability, accessibility, usability, and stability. Lastly, in this figure, interventions such as mitigation and adaptation can reduce risks to our food systems, improve our food security, and thus improve our broader human well-being. Next slide. So I just mentioned that there can be different types or elements of food systems, such as local-based or trade-based. These are just two examples. And I think something interesting for me in helping write this section is really thinking about the fact that these different elements of a food system, they each have unique strengths and weaknesses in the face of climate change. So for example, the local-based elements of a food system are good at helping insulate communities against large-scale disruptions that affect the flow of food inward from other places. So for example, during the COVID pandemic, local farmers and mobile meat processors helped insulate their communities against some of the effects of worker shortages in the commercial food processing and transportation sectors. Conversely, trade-based elements of a food system are good at helping fill gaps in food availability when a localized shock occurs, like a hailstorm that destroys a local source of vegetables, or a spring freeze that damages all the buds on local fruit trees. So each of these elements of the food system, local, non-local, again, there's lots of other types of food systems out there. They have strengths and weaknesses that are unique and that can complement each other. They also have different implications for greenhouse gas emissions, socioeconomic outcomes, and ecosystem goods and services like biodiversity, water quality, and carbon storage. Next slide. So on that note, our food system is not only affected by climate change, but also contributes to it by emitting greenhouse gases. And this figure shows that GHG emissions occur through all stages of our food system or our food supply chain. Production, i.e. growing and harvesting our crops and livestock, that represents about 48% of the overall GHG emissions from the food supply chain. The other 52% of emissions from the food supply chain, those are emitted during later stages of the food supply chain. So GHG emissions in food production are primarily, as Virginia alluded to earlier, they're primarily from soil and land use management, fertilizer production and use, enteric methane from livestock, and farm energy use. But beyond the farm gate, emissions come primarily from energy use and the use of chlorofluorocarbons involved in refrigeration. Next slide. So now that we know what a food system is and how it affects climate change, let's discuss some examples of how climate change affects our food system. So in the top row of this figure, you see a variety of extreme events, which earlier chapters in the NCA5 show are being fueled by climate change. These extreme events affect each step in the food supply chain, which is shown in the second row in the dark blue text boxes. And below each step in the light blue boxes are examples of how climate change is affecting that step or sector. Some of these examples result in what we call compounding or cascading effects on the food system. One example is when drought reduces demand for farm workers in the production sector over in the left. Those farm workers are also consumers over on the right end of this spectrum. And if there's not demand for their labor, then they can't afford to buy as much food. And this compounds or worsens the disproportional food insecurity that they've historically experienced. An example of a cascading effect would be a hurricane that knocks out electricity in a local community, which then triggers the need for workers at the local grocery store to quickly deal with the risk of any food, frozen food spoiling. But those workers might be stuck at home dealing with their own emergencies, so that the grocery store ends up being shorthanded. And if any consumers can actually get to the grocery store to purchase food, what if the credit card machines don't work because there's no electricity, and nor does the ATM? And who carries around their checkbook anymore? So this makes it a challenge to actually pay for the food they want, ultimately resulting in more food waste. So this is an example that was actually inspired by the hurricanes in 2017 that hit Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. These are just a few examples among many that you see here and many beyond of cascading or compounding effects of climate change on the food systems that each and every one of us participate in and rely upon. Next slide. So this figure is going to give you additional examples of how climate change is affecting our food system. The primary difference here is that this diagram is organized by different dimensions of food security. So again, food availability, accessibility, usability. And very quickly, I'll just return to our hurricane story. In that story, we saw people were able to make it to the store, but they couldn't buy the food. So the food was available, but not accessible because there was an economic barrier. What about people who stayed at home during and after the hurricane? They also lost electricity, and that may have prevented them from safely refrigerating or cooking the perishable foods that they already had on hand. In their case, the food was available and accessible, but no longer usable. And so I think this example demonstrates that food security can be challenged by physical barriers to food, which then go on to create health factors of concern. It's really complicated. And the point of these two figures are to help us think really creatively and thoroughly about the many different ways that climate change can threaten food security. It's not just about how it's affecting food production at the farm gate. That's just the beginning of the story. And for the rest of the story, including how some communities, rural communities, are building resilience, I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Tracy, to talk about key message 3.
Thanks, Danelle, and hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Farragon, an economic geographer with the USDA Economic Research Service, Resource and Rural Economics Division. I'll be highlighting some of the information that inform key message number 3, which focuses on the importance of rural communities as stewards of much of the nation's natural resources and the unique challenges and opportunities that rural communities face with respect to increasing their resilience to climate change. In order to evaluate rural communities in the context of climate change, we must first understand what is meant by the term rural. Next slide. Ideas and definitions relating to the term rural are diverse. Population density and geographic isolation are often key rural defining factors for climate researchers and policymakers. So too are characteristics of the natural environment and the economy, such as areas of agriculture and forestry. Rural is broadly defined and discussed throughout NCA5, which covers land area and populations across the United States, including U.S.-affiliated Pacific and Caribbean islands, as well as federally recognized tribal land. However, in order to evaluate rural in a way that involves enumeration, we use data on non-metropolitan areas, defined by the Federal Office of Management and Budget on the basis of counties or county equivalents. We note that rural areas comprise 2/3 of the nation's total land area, are home to approximately 46.1 million people, and include the majority of Indigenous census respondents. These numbers can differ, of course, depending on the data year and source, but the statistics provided are generally representative of rural communities in the aggregate. And relative to the topics covered and already discussed for this chapter, we found that there is extensive evidence that supports the interrelationship of agriculture, food systems, and rural communities, such as the importance of agriculture as a driver of rural economics and social systems, and also well documented are the efforts to conserve the natural resources on which many rural communities depend, not only for agriculture, but also for other natural amenities-based industries, such as recreation and retirement destination communities. Next slide. As Carl mentioned in the chapter introduction, one of the tasks of NCA authors is to evaluate where we have been and where we are going in terms of research, strategies, and trends since the previous climate assessment. In that respect, we don't attempt to report on every single aspect of rural communities in the context of climate change in our chapter, but rather we draw upon the literature to understand the emerging issues and research gaps at a high level of analysis. And further, also as mentioned by Carl, in working with other chapter authors, we find that there was a great deal of overlap on what we might cover in this chapter on rural communities and the issues covered elsewhere in NCA5. So for more nuanced discussions of issues pertaining to rural, these can be found in other chapters, and we provide links to those discussions where appropriate. For instance, in our chapter, we briefly discuss historical environmental justice inequities that continue to impact rural communities. And we provide a link to the social systems and justice chapter for more in-depth reading on this topic. And as with all subject matter covered in NCA5, links to specific research citations are provided in the traceable account sections at the end of the chapter. So considering where we have been, key message number 4 in the Agricultural and Rural Communities chapter of the 4th National Climate Assessment focused on the vulnerability and adaptive capacity of rural communities. And the primary emerging issues and research gaps were defined by the need for more social science research that contributes to improving the understanding of rural community vulnerabilities, strategies to enhance adaptive capacity and resilience, and barriers to adoption of new strategies. In our work on NCA5, we found that there has been progress to that end, but that there is ample need for additional research, particularly with respect to strategies for building resiliency. Next slide. Extensive data and research show that rural communities support agricultural and food systems. Further, many rural communities bear responsibility for protecting the natural resources and ecosystem services they provide. And we found evidence of growth in the number of programs focused on capacity building and providing support to rural and underserved communities. And examples are offered throughout NCA5. For instance, in the Indigenous Peoples chapter, the majority of which live in rural areas, increases in federally funded renewable energy projects are highlighted. This includes expansion by project type and funding amounts over the last several decades. Similarly, efforts to enhance energy system resilience for both rural and urban communities are highlighted in the Energy Supply, Delivery, and Demand chapter. So links to these and other examples of evidence to enhance adaptive capacity and resilience of rural communities are embedded throughout our chapter in the rural community section. However, we also found ample research that documents the ongoing challenges for rural communities in sustaining their way of life. Those challenges include, but are not limited to, persistent poverty and historical inequities, particularly along the lines of race and ethnicity, population loss and an aging population, natural resource depletion and a loss of farmland, and limited on and off farm economic opportunities. And for many rural communities, these challenges are persistent and as such have remained a theme through each iteration of the National Climate Assessment. Further, we found that there is a growing body of research that illustrates that vulnerable rural populations are disproportionately at high risk of climate change impacts, which can further exacerbate existing problems. For instance, many rural areas face the challenges of concentrated poverty and lagging economic growth alongside increasingly severe side effects of climate change. While not all urban areas are prosperous or without severe climate effects, rural communities on average lag behind their urban counterparts on most key economic and climate resiliency indicators. With regard to those indicators, one of the most significant changes that we found since NCA4 has been in the area of data development and access, which was also mentioned for the other topics covered in this chapter by my co-authors. Those data have not only been used to advance research, but they have been made more accessible to communities in need. And so we highlight one of these data sets in the body of our chapter, while also identifying others in our traceable accounts section. Next slide, please. The highlighted data example is the Baseline Resilience Indicators for Communities, or BRIC Index. It is a composite measure of community resilience to natural hazards, and it considers 49 indicators of existing attributes of resilience arranged in six broad categories, including social, infrastructure, institutional, environmental, economic, and community capital. The indicators shown in this figure within each of the broad categories are those that have been found to be positive and negative drivers of resilience for rural communities in particular. For example, under community capital, researchers using the BRIC index found the indicators of attachment to place, religious social capital, and political engagement positively impact rural community resiliency. Conversely, lack of community volunteers and lack of engagement in formal disaster preparedness programs negatively impact rural community resiliency. Next slide, please. And BRIC data can be used to compare community resilience within one county to that of another. Further, it can be used to look at within county differences across the 6 broad categories as shown here. The maps highlight rural counties only, and they indicate the baseline category with the highest and lowest scores relative to the composite index values for each individual county. For example, considering the map on the left, the counties highlighted in yellow, which is the brightest color on the map, indicate that there is a spatial concentration of counties where infrastructure has had the greatest positive impact on climate resiliency. This doesn't mean that they necessarily score the highest on infrastructure across all rural counties, but rather the infrastructure stands out as the most positively impactful within the county itself. And then considering the map on the right, the counties highlighted in blue, which is the darkest color on the map, are those where the baseline category for institutional factors had the greatest negative impact on rural community resiliency. Further discussion of resilience vulnerabilities appears in our chapter, and also for specific areas, information about vulnerabilities can in fact be found in other chapters, such as the chapter on the Midwest and on other regions or specific or sector-specific chapters. Next slide, please. So overall, we found that emerging research using BRIC or other newly developed data sets related to climate risk and resiliency demonstrates that the diverse social, economic, and institutional contexts in which vulnerable rural populations are embedded can further influence their individual and collective capacity to communicate, cooperate, and cope with a climate disturbance events. That is, while this perspective has been reported on and supported by research in the past, recent advances in data-driven analytical capabilities has elevated the empirical evidence. However, there remains an outstanding need for social science research on the ways that rural communities could successfully adapt to changing climate and related events. This requires additional research and training that takes into consideration a variety of potential strategies across the diversity of rural communities. And this picture shown here, just to mention, is from the NCA5 Climate Art Gallery. It's a representation of what success might look like in the diverse community context of the Pacific Northwest. And with that, I'll say thank you and turn it back over to our host for Q&A.
All right, thank you, Virginia, Danelle, and Tracy. Before we go to Q&A, I just want to recognize our incredible author team who worked tirelessly on this chapter for over 3 years. We're all federal employees, and that is mandated for this chapter by the Federal Steering Committee. We want to thank our review editor, of course, USGCRP, TSU for doing our figures, and of course, Chris, who patiently shepherded us through this entire process. So with that, we'll open up to Q&A. Chris?